Coaching Soccer Weekly, episode 328. Interview with Andrew Clifton. Entertaining, educational, and inspiring soccer content to help make you a more effective coach, player, or soccer parent. Hello, and welcome back to Coaching Soccer Weekly, presented by World Class Coaching. My name is Sega Verbinovich, and this is the podcast devoted to bringing you cutting-edge methods, techniques, and tactics for coaching soccer. It doesn't matter if you're an experienced coach who has been training teams for many years, or if you're new to coaching and working with the team for the very first time. There's something we can all do to take our coaching to the next level. Welcome back to the show. This past weekend's review is brought to you by VO. VO is an amazing tool that I use every Monday, every Saturday for our players. It is a video camera. It has a 180-degree view, and it records your games. It brings up highlights, and it's a really good analytical tool that we use on Monday nights during our Zoom meetings where we review our games from the past weekend, and it just gives me a better insight of the game and just how we did. If you are looking for VO for your academy or club, you can use our code CSW Coaching Soccer Weekly 100. That's CSW 100 to get your VO. And thank you, VO, for sponsoring this show. So this past weekend started with our 2013 team. Our 2013 team played against a weaker team, and that's kind of what I wanted. We got to a point where we were up by, I think, 4, and I was able to take out the starters that are usually getting a lot more playing time. They had 3 more games that day, if you can believe it or not. So they came off. We were also missing 2 other players. And when I talk about starters, I'm really talking about half of the team played with the 2012s last year, so they played up a year. And now we combined it with brand new 2013. So we kind of have a lineup, 2 different lineups. One is those that played with the 12s, and now the new ones with the 13. So we had essentially 2 that were missing from that team that played 2012. So they weren't there. And then I took the other 2 off as well and just really let the 2013 brand new players play. And I thought they did pretty well. You know, we played, like I said, a weaker team. We had most of the possession. Our first touch isn't great. Our 1v1s isn't great. But things are starting to come together. And that's really what I was expecting, them to kind of just start to get the hang of it. And hopefully by indoor, they'll be able to kind of catch up to where the 2012s were last year in that position. After that, our 2010 black team, that's our B team, played, and it was the exact opposite of the 2013. Our goalkeeper for that team sprained his finger, so he wasn't there. We were also missing 3 other starters. So 2 of our 2013s played up 3 years at that point, because if not, we would have just had to forfeit the game. So it just wasn't a good game, to be honest. There was really, it really didn't help anyone that game. So a little bit frustrating from that point of view, but you know, a good learning experience, I thought, for the players. And yeah, that was our second game. Our third and fourth game were all 2012. So we had that community weekend with our 2012s, which essentially means that all 2012s in the district come together to play in one place. And just like it was with the 2010 disaster, super small nets, like they were the bow nets, the 4x6s, I think. So really small, 7v7 in a 5v5 field. So very tight area, very small nets, almost impossible to score. And no parking. So I had to walk about 20 minutes from where I parked my car with all my equipment. So again, just not really planned well. And so we were at a field, and there were 3 teams at the field, and we rotated playing each other. So each team played the other teams for a total of 2 games, and each game was only 30 minutes long. So again, I don't know. But we got lucky in our schedule, and we had back-to-back games, so we didn't have to sit and wait around for 30 minutes while the other team was playing. And those 2 games were probably the best 2 games we've played so far in the whole season with any team. It was everything that gave us the Gladiator identity. 1v1 moves, building out of the back, switching the ball, crossing it on the ground with pass backs, and just absolutely possession all the way. Even in such a small space, we did really well. We played a team that we've played a lot. Usually that team, their coach is yelling constantly. And he did at the beginning, but I think he just kind of gave up. His teams were just not, his one team, sorry, that we played, they just couldn't win the ball back. They couldn't do it. And we ended up winning the game 1-0, which had the nets been bigger, we definitely would have gotten a lot more goals. But, I thought the players fought really well. The second game, we played a team that was huge. They were big, strong, fast. And for me, I love that for our players. It's a really good experience because our players do 1v1s and they're in constant battle mode when we do that in our sessions. And that's going to be really what today is about. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it was just, there was, going into the game, we saw them play, and I talked to the players, move the ball quickly. They're big, strong, fast. All they do is kick that ball up. So the ball's going to be in our zone a lot, so we have to get back right away. And I don't know what it is about our 2012s, but whenever we're playing a bigger, stronger team, they just love the 1v1s, and they'll go at them and at them and at them, and they'll beat them. And it was just an incredible game. Very back and forth in the sense that we would build out of the back. We would go, get a shot off, and then their goalkeeper would get it. They would kick it up, and then we would have to do it all over again. So back and forth, and just very physical. Very, very physical, and our players held on. We ended up tying that game 1-1, and when I was coaching, I originally thought that they had more chances, and if the nets were bigger, we would have probably lost by 3-4 goals. But watching it back again on VO, we did really well. We probably could have won that game had it been bigger nets, bigger field, but I guess we'll never know. But just an incredible weekend for that 2012 team. I'm so absolutely proud of that team. Every time I watch those players play, I'm just happy. I can see the image that I wanted my teams to play in them. They are definitely a gladiator team, and I think the 2013s need to get there. The 2010s black and gold, they have gladiator moments, but they're not at that 2012. And that's very expected because the 2012s, most of those players I've had for 3-4 years. So you can really see that development. So today's episode is a really good episode because I have an interview with Andrew Clifton, who I'll introduce in a little bit. But before that, there's a question. And this question's been on my mind for a really long time. And I think I've kind of figured out the best way to answer it. So here it is. Obviously, when I'm coaching, for me, it's about development. It's not about winning. I've said that 1,000 times. But it's hard to know if that's actually true. Because there are times when, like, for example, this past weekend, where I told that our goalkeeper to kick the ball up. And that's not something that I usually say, but the game was so intense and such a situation of it's a 1-1 tie. We fought really hard for this game, and there were about 2 minutes left, so kicking it up. But then there was another moment in the game where their goalie picked it up from a pass back, and it was about 5 yards from their small little goal. And I told our player to kick it back to the goalkeeper to play on because we don't take those. So how do you know if you're actually playing a developmental game or if winning is more important? And here's my question. And this is a question for you to answer, no one else. This is for something for you to reflect on. So here it is. Would you rather your team be the better team and lose? Or would you rather your team be the worst team and win? And it's a very easy question, but it's a very powerful one. There are times in the game where we scored in the past and I was frustrated because I didn't like the way we scored because it wasn't our style. There are times when my goalkeeper kicks it up and it bounces over 3 players, and then our fast forward gets the ball and scores. And I'm not happy. I'm not happy with that goal. That's not – there were 2 players out of 9 that touched the ball. That's not development. However, there are other times where we build out of the back, and this happened this weekend. We built out of the back very well. Ball goes to the winger, just like we've practiced. Winger takes the ball down, provides a really great cross on the ground, a diagonal ball from the half space, and tap in, hits our player's arm, and goes in the net. And that makes me so happy, even if the goal is disallowed, because it's exactly what we work towards. So the question you really have to reflect on to know if you're a developmental team, if you're a team that puts priority over winning, is in games, would you rather be the better team that loses, or would you rather be the worst team that wins? And yes, I know a bunch of you are probably saying, well, you could be the better team and win. You can. 100%, I agree with that. But it's a lot tougher to do that. And most of the time, that's not going to happen, especially in under 8, under 9, under 10, when you're trying to build out of the back constantly, because the players are going to make mistakes. And those are going to end up in a goal. If out of 10, if you're successfully building out of the back 6 times, those 4 times, which is a pretty good average, I would say, for building out of the back with a U9 team, those 4 times, 3 of those could end up at a goal, especially with the size of these nets, gigantic. So just something for you to reflect on before I introduce Andrew. Andrew is, well, let me start it this way. I'm really fortunate, and I want to thank you, the listeners, again, because whenever I reflect on my coaching and see the issues that I have, because I'm not perfect, I have a lot of issues that I'm still trying to work through. One of them is shooting. So what I do is I go out and I find people who are experts in whatever I'm struggling with, and I'm very fortunate to be able to bring them on this show so they can talk to us about their knowledge. And Andrew is one of those experts, in my opinion. I've talked about Andrew's club forever. It's the Kansas City Legends, and I've had Andy on the show. He's the 1v1 expert. And Andrew is, he's been working with Andy for a very long time. He also played for Andy, grew up with him from the time he was 5. And he's also one of the hosts of Andy's podcast, Coaching Inside the Box, I believe. And yeah, it was a really great conversation. It was a long conversation, so I'm going to stop talking. And here we go. My interview with Andrew Clifton. Please enjoy. And yeah, here we go. I'm super excited to have Andrew on the show. Andrew and I have a lot of things in common. We played for the same coach who I've talked about a lot on the show, Andy. But I want to really jump into it right away. And we'll start with welcoming Andrew Clifton to the show. Welcome, Andrew.
Hey, thanks. I'm really excited as well. Like I've listened to many episode, and so actually being on is kind of a fun deal.
All right. Well, can you tell the listeners in about 200 words a little bit about who you are, kind of your upbringing, and where you're at now?
Yeah. So as mentioned, my name's Andrew Clifton. I'm really excited today because I live in Kansas City, grew up in Kansas City, and yesterday we were announced as a World Cup host city. So
yep, and so are we. So I'm excited.
Toronto
too.
As well. Yeah, this is really great news. But that's not why we're chatting today. I grew up in Kansas City and played for the same club, Legend Soccer Club. all the way through. Andy Barney was my coach all the way through. I went off, I played university. I coached high school soccer for a few years, and then have worked full-time in soccer for the next 15, largely as a coach educator and a coach within our own club structure and kind of club network. I've coached kids from 2 or 3 all the way up to 18. I'm really, really, really passionate about skill development and skill acquisition and building confident players, right? Like if you don't believe you can do it, then you can't. And so that's kind of a big function of what I do. And I love the early ages, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 10 to 12 is kind of like my wheelhouse. That's where I like to be.
That's awesome. So I've talked about your podcast that you're a host on. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about that, how that came about as well?
Yeah. So we call it Coaching Inside the Box, but it's really a labor of love. We got started simply because Andy, who's much older and the director of our club, who's English, and then I'm American, and then Philippe, who coaches in our club, and him and I have just, established a really good friendship over the last 5 years or so. The 3 of us, he's Brazilian, Philippe's Brazilian, and it's just kind of like youth soccer and development and culture collision is really what we look at, right? And we try to talk about ways in which we teach the game or the environments we develop for players to learn about the game and how that impacts everything, and the differences between Brazilian culture, that's where Philippe grew up, and English culture, and a long time ago, because Andy's old, and that's where Andy grew up, and how that intersects with American culture. And I think we do a unique thing. Like I'm really proud of it. I love it. I love the banter that exists on the show because we're all really quite close. So it's called Coaching Inside the Box. It's a fun time for sure.
Yeah. I think for coaches out there who are listening, it's a really unique opportunity because you have 3 different viewpoints. And a lot of the time, Andy comes in, says one thing, and then Philippe will come in and say one thing, and then you'll come in and say one thing. So it's really, really good. Just like the introduction says, a Brazilian, an Englishman, and an American coming together and having a unique conversation about soccer development, which is just not something that's out there a lot. And we spoke a little bit about that. And I've spoken at length about the 1v1s that you guys do, because I do that with my club as well, and all that, and the 1v1 moves. But the big thing that I struggle with the most, and I see this a lot as well, is shooting. I think the most that coaches do with shooting, and I think, you'll appreciate this, as I'm sure you see in games, you get to the game and what happens? The first 2 players come in and they're just shooting on the net. And it's like that in practice, right? And that's really a lot of the time what shooting practice comes down to. There isn't really a lot of technical work, and there isn't a lot of repetition. So let's start first of all, because I know you guys do it in a really unique way, what environment you've been able to create at the Legends Club to help players develop shooting to what I would say is a professional level. And then kind of before you had the environment that you had, what kind of led up to it, and maybe what you think coaches can take away from it. And we'll start at least with that, which is a lot.
Yeah. No worries. Shooting's a tough thing to work on when you think about it from the perspective of we as coaches, like priority number 1 is to make sure the kids are engaged, right? And so if the kids aren't engaged, then whatever you're planning to do that day isn't going to work. And shooting is tough because shooting inherently is swinging your leg through a ball and trying to hit it with pace and power. And so that ball can end up anywhere.
Yep.
And so it's really tough to run a super efficient, engaging practice that is accomplishing something if balls are flying in every direction. And so, currently now we have our own indoor facilities. We call them the soccer box, but they're really tight spaces that work toward building a ton of repetitions in a short amount of time, right? Think racquetball court, think wall where kids are shooting against the wall and the ball is bouncing back to them. But as a kid growing up, that's not the environment that we had, right? And so we had it 6 months of the year. During the winter, we ended up on a small indoor training field with walls, and so we could use those. But 6 months of the year, we were outside, and there was no wall. There was no rebound surface of any note. And so we had to create unique approaches to training and getting those repetitions in. as you mentioned, in my opinion, shooting comes down to two really big things, right? There's the technical aspect in terms of how do you actually teach the technique in a way that kids can absorb it and quickly put it into action. And then there's the repetition aspect in terms of, they can know how to do it, conceptually all day long, but if they don't actually repeat it over and over and over again under some pressure, they're not going to be any good come Saturday or Sunday at the game.
Yeah. And I think one of the tools that I use all the time that were provided by your YouTube page is Legends Maestro. And Andy does a really great job in breaking down each of those moves. And one of those moves is the fake shot. And the fake shot really teaches players that setup process, foot beside the ball. I love the donkey kick, that, things like that. So that's what I use for the before part of shooting. And then as soon as it's the contact part with young kids, it's really tough, right? Because they don't know where to hit the ball, right? They don't know how it feels and they don't know how to change it. They don't have that awareness yet. So while they're doing these, the soccer box in that world, what are the coaching points that you guys talk about in that environment?
Yeah. So you talk about feel and for kids understanding what it feels like. And I think that's a really important element to teaching it. And so, I mean, some of the coaching points I have is like, we literally take our shoes off and I have the kids find that bone that runs from their big toe up to their ankle, right? It's on the inside, but the top of the foot. I'm like, and I go through a whole process of, guys, that bone is where your power comes from. And so you've got to have contact there. And, we talk about locking your ankle, right? And having your toe pointed out just a few degrees so that bone is really hitting it. And the kids get the visual stimulation on that front, but then they also get the feel, the touch to understand that. And then I get down on my hands and knees, right? And they've put their shoe back on, and I'm literally holding their foot and pulling their foot into the ball while I've got my other hand on the ball, so they can feel like this is what it should feel like when you catch it just right. Your ankle's locked, your toe is down, and that bone is connecting with the ball. And so really work through that. And I feel like, this is scientific, this is certainly subjective, but like, I feel like for young kids, and I don't just mean like 5-year-olds, I mean all the way up to, 12, 13, like if they have bad technique, their first time feeling that technique, it makes a difference. They're like, oh, I'm not supposed to be swinging my toe through this thing. I get it now, right? Like, oh, I'm supposed to lock my ankle, right? Oh, this, my laces or the inside of my laces is going to give me that great power on top of that bone. And I think kids kind of get supercharged about it. They're like, oh, yeah, you're right. This bone does feel strong. I'm going to have such powerful shots. And it builds that excitement to it as well. And so that's a really important piece for me as we initially get doing it. And then we get into repetitions right away, right? And so I'm not trying to teach the whole thing of shooting in that first session, or for us, even in that first several months, right? Like it's a slow growth of everything. And we just try to have shooting as an ever-present piece of our sessions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. And then when you get into that racquetball environment, how do you are there games that you use in that environment to keep the kids engaged, right? So is there are there rules to the racquetball type thing? How does that work?
Yeah, so there are. Initially, I try to avoid rules, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. Because they just get in the way. There becomes discussion. It becomes counterproductive, and eventually we've got to do that. But on the front end, just shooting the ball and hitting it hard with power against a fence, against a wall, against anything is fun, right? And so for me, at that point, it's a matter of just getting them going, and they're just all. For us, usually we have the center I train in only has 7 box soccer courts, and so we have 2 kids per box. And so I'm just kind of wandering around the boxes on the outside. And I don't know, there's a ton of YouTube content and videos that you can find that'll show this, but just giving the kids instruction. Once we get going and they've kind of figured it out a little bit, then I'll start expanding it into games. Right. And so it'll be games where and I usually try to have the 2 kids work together in the younger age groups. because I feel like if they work together, then there'll be some accountability for making sure that they're actually getting the repetitions the right way. But it limits arguments, and young kids argue all the time, right? And so it limits arguments, and they're now in a team phase. But we'll count, okay, the number of shots with good power where you hit it with that bone on your foot, right? And we're going for 2 minutes. Every single group of 2 is competing against each other, but they're together. The individual group of 2 are together. And they come out of their boxes sweating, and they're like, we got 52. That is awesome. So somebody else is like, we got 53. And they just made up that number because somebody else got 52. But it creates this environment that's really engaging and moving. And then from there, I mean, we have all types of other activities. Sometimes, as the kids get older, if we're working on shots with bend, right? Like the in-swinger or the out-swinger, then they'll be counting those. As they get older, there's games just like racquetball. If you could imagine a racquetball game or a tennis game, we've got games like that, just the same.
That's awesome. And then when they're in that environment, do you have, because I know, for example, in the 1v1s, it's a tournament format a lot of the time, right? And you're recording scores. Do you record scores in this environment as well when they come out? Or is it more like, I got 50, I got 52, and then you're like, okay, and then you kind of switch it up?
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends. Most often for my groups, we're in the boxes for 20, 30 minutes a session. Right. And so in that short amount of time, I find that just them giving me their score and then quickly comparing it to everybody else. And maybe whoever got the highest score gets to, give everybody like a goofy dance they've got to do, or, something fun, something that keeps the engagement high and the fun level high. I find that to be good enough. But when I have sessions that are an hour in length, right, and I've got my older kids, 13 and 14-year-olds in those boxes, if I don't pull out the pen and paper, then 20, 30 minutes in, their engagement and their effort drops. And so I've got to keep that high. If I'm not feeding that competitive, and this is on the boys and the girls side, if I'm not feeding that competitive personality or perception, right, then the effort will drop for me is what I found.
Yeah. And you talked about repetition, obviously, is an important part of it, but there's repetition, and then there is repetition in an environment that makes the repetition good, right? So for example, if you had just a wall and 50 players hitting the ball against the wall with nothing behind them, right? That's different, obviously, than your box courts, which are a box. What are the benefits of having that box and having the players enclosed in a small area?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, for me, right, I played at a high level in college, and we had training where it was like, okay, we're going to do finishing today. And we'd spend 30 minutes of finishing, and genuinely with good service, at a high level of the collegiate game, I'd get 5, 6, 7, 10 good repetitions because the service wasn't perfect. Whereas if I compare that to largely my youth indoor soccer training, where when we were inside, we had one flat wall and we played what we called wall ball. But it's a 2-touch game where you shoot it against the wall and it comes back and you settle it. And then you shoot it against the wall and it comes back and the next guy settles it. Right. And it's a 2-person, just like tennis really is the best way to put it. And for us, like oftentimes it was every shot had to be, under 4 foot and level. Your touch had to be clean, and then a quick shot, within a couple of seconds, so you lost the point. And so it was competitive from that perspective. And that's really good at developing that first touch, and then that first touch that sets you up for a quick shot afterward. But then I think it was probably 8, 9, 10 years ago, Andy, we built our first indoor facility, and we had a small bit of space at the back. And Andy was like, we're going to put a soccer squash court under there, is what he called it at the time. And we were like, okay, that sounds good. And it was, it was four walls. It was a rectangle. And we just started playing. And what we found out very quickly by having 4 walls around us is that our repetition wasn't just a touch from the front wall and then a shot. It actually mimicked the game, where sometimes we would be striking the ball off of the front wall, right? Our shot would come off the front wall. In like the keeper's made a save and we're following it up. Other times it's coming off the sidewall. And so we're actually having to contort our body and spin through it. almost mimicking a cross, a ball coming in from the side. And sometimes it's coming off the back wall. They shoot it, it goes off the front wall, then the back wall, and I'm having to get my shot from it coming from behind me, almost mimicking a through ball that's come through, and I've beaten the defenders, and now I'm just trying to put it in the back of the net. And so those repetitions became more varied. They weren't just the same repetition over and over again. And because we're in a box with a roof, the ball's never escaping. And so for 2 minutes, I mean, it is hell for leather, just over and over and over again, getting repetitions. And so it amped up the fun and the number of repetitions. So the skill acquisition increased significantly.
Yeah, I think I have so much respect, obviously, for Andy, but any coaches out there who sees a problem within their club, their team, their academy, and creates an environment with that repetition and just constantly tries to improve on it and improve on it. And what's really great about you is that you've seen that improvement because you started out without that box court, and you've kind of gone through and seen the difference that it's made. So what have you seen from kind of when you played your teammates up until now? What's it look like now for your players? And, what's the comfort level when you go into a game and your team is fighting because of the 1v1s. There's no team out there that I know my teams aren't going to go out and compete, win or lose. But now you've added this added value of, can they shoot from anywhere? Well, it looks like, yeah. And that just probably gives you so much confidence stepping onto the field. If you're 3-2 down or, and it's a state cup game, any single one of those players can, with one shot, change the game.
Yeah. It's a really good question. So the team I played on growing up, and we could play, right? Like, all of us were good. We were a high level club team, but there were only a few of the guys on the team that were true finishers, right? We all struck a ball pretty well, but there were only a few guys on the team that could really find the back of the net when the chips are down under pressure. And we trained shooting a lot then, right? It just wasn't as efficient as an approach as we have now. Just recently, and this was Andy's idea, with all of the parents on the sideline with their own phone cameras, and then the Veos and the Traces and all the different cameras that exist, right? It was early this spring. Andy said, why don't we start collecting this footage, having parents submit it, and then let's have a top 10 goals every week and it's Philippe actually that produces. He's pretty good with video editing. And so Philippe produced all spring long a top 10 goal. And what that demonstrated for us was that it wasn't the same kids every week with this top 10 goal, right? We were a big club, but like it was a numerous, many different kids, even within my own teams. My 2013 boys, so U9 boys, are very, very, very good. And I think I had 8 different kids score a top 10 club-wide level goal throughout the spring. And I think it comes from the repetition, and the environment is encouraging everybody to become that and believe in that and have that self-belief. And whether you believe you can or you can't, you are right. And that's something that kids hear me say all the time. And so we want to create an environment where it stimulates that. Oh, I can do it. Give me the ball. Yeah, I'll have a go. And I think that makes a difference.
Yeah. And as you say that, I can think about each of my teams, and I can kind of just list 2-3 players that, if we're down, I want them, I put them in a certain position because I know they're going to get a shot, and they've got we call it fire rocket, right? Yeah. But what an experience as a coach to sit there on the sideline and be like, oh, Johnny's tired. Come off. Eric, go in. And he goes in and smashes that when, that's incredible. So now let's talk about, obviously it's impossible to create that atmosphere unless you have that soccer box court. But what can coaches out there who don't have that, what can they do in their training sessions to try and mimic that as much as possible?
Yeah. So in 2015, my daughter, who's now 15, was playing on the Kansas side of Kansas City, which is where our club home is. And our kids were getting older. My wife, and the age group change happened in the United States, where all of a sudden everybody was the teams had to shuffle. So our team was going to change. And my wife said, why are we driving all the way to Kansas? And my daughter wasn't particularly good. She was into it ish, but like she was just, just a soccer player, just having fun. Why are we driving all the way to Kansas, an hour round trip for these sessions? Can you just start a team here in on the Missouri side in Lee Summit where you live? And I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. So I threw up just a post on Facebook. Who wants to come play for Liv's soccer team? I'm going to coach him. And because we put together that team, we no longer had the indoor facility to train in, right? And so we had to train outside. And so I had to employ a lot of those strategies and tactics that Andy had given us when we were kids, but I had to make up some stuff too, because the environment wasn't exactly the same. And I've been coaching for a while now in the indoor facility, so my perspective was a little bit different. And so the first thing I did in the field that we had is I found a baseball backstop that was like 100 yards off the field. Okay. And we went to the baseball backstop, not on the field side, but on the backside. And I remember the parents were like, wait, you're practicing over there today? I'm like, yeah, we're going to do some shooting. And I don't want the kids to chase the ball. And so I put them literally just 4 feet from the backstop. And then I just went up and down the line of kids, like literally moving their foot, just as I explained before, doing the whole bone thing, getting a ton of repetitions against that fence to where the kids felt like, okay, this is working. I can do this. They never had to chase the ball. I mean, it was, 2 or 3, 4 shots in a minute, good shots. And that was way better than it would be otherwise, but not nearly as good as it would be at our indoor facility. And then once they kind of figured it out, and I felt like their technique was good enough that now I can put a little bit of pressure to it, is I took all my cones and I created a line of cones across the field. And the cones were, because the girls were young and not particularly good yet, I think I put them like 6 feet apart. So 6 paces apart. So a good size space that they're going to shoot through. And the grass was quite long, which actually helped in this front because it kept the ball from straying too far. And the girls would be on line of cones. And so I essentially created, however many gates, probably 6 gates for the girls. And then there were 2 on either side of each gate. And so a line of girls on either side. And the girls would literally shoot the ball through the cones to their teammate who would take a touch, who would shoot it back through the cone, to the teammate who would take a touch, who would shoot it back through the cone, to a teammate who would take a touch. And at first it was just rally. It was just repetition. And then I started creating games and activities where they were counting good quality shots. Every shot had to be under 4 feet. So I said below your waist, right? We were trying to keep the ball low with power. And we were off to the races and it was working really well. And so that was largely how my girls learned to shoot for the first 6 months they were with me until it hit winter. And then finally I was able to go inside and justify an indoor practice rental space. Again, not at the Legends facility, but just a rental. And I found a wall that we could use and kind of build from there. And it worked. I mean, it's not as good, but it's better than. And the thing, if I were to offer any coach's advice, is I think we as coaches oftentimes try to avoid chaos in practice, right? Yeah. I mean, human nature is to avoid chaos in practice. And so if something starts looking bad or it's kind of a little chaotic, we try to like tamp it down and maybe the parents on the sideline, we don't want them to see the chaotic nature of it. And so I can assure you that this session that I ran was chaotic, right? Because balls were flying everywhere, but I just stuck with it. And I just stuck with it. And I just stuck with it. And 4, 5, 6 sessions later of the girls shooting through these cones, they started to figure it out. And then it didn't look chaotic anymore. And it was a really good exercise for repetition with shooting. And so my biggest advice to coach always is invite chaos. If it's not chaotic, it's probably not as good as it could be from a repetition perspective or from an environmental perspective to really achieve what we want to as coaches.
And
I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Yeah. And what is it about that chaotic environment that you love so much?
I mean, there's 2 things. One is, let me first say, oftentimes when kids aren't good at something, they're going to be bad at it, which invites chaos. And if you're not working on things that kids aren't good at, then they're not growing as players. Right. And so for us, as a club, as philosophically, like we think shooting is the most important thing. We don't really work on the technique of passing. We think that it's the transfer of training, the economy of training. If kids can shoot, they can also pass. So just work on shooting. You only get the kids so much time. And so that's one piece of it, right? Like you want them outside of their comfort zone, working on different things. The second piece of it is that in chaos is outside of their comfort zone. But we as humans have the ability to understand and figure out chaos if you give us a bit of time. And then it becomes inside of our comfort zone, right? And so the speed of play is something that like, oh, this is frantic and crazy. Well, do it a few times and then it doesn't become frantic and crazy. And if we play out of our comfort zone in training more often, if our sessions are more chaotic than the teams we play against, when we play them on the weekends, we're able to play at a faster pace in a more chaotic environment compared to what the other team is used to. And for that reason, we're more successful. I'm a big fan of avoiding structure. That's why I can't stand, I shouldn't say avoiding structure, but avoiding sessions that look overly structured. I think look good, but don't feel good long term. So.
Yeah. And I think to that chaotic point, what I found is, with the 1v1s, and this is going to be a really good transition because we're going to shift gears in a second. I didn't prop you for this, so, but I know you'll be okay. So, in the last 2, 3, 4 minutes, when it's a 4-4 game, 5-4 game, that's the chaos. Your C start, the other team will kick the ball out, whatever that is, and that's where the players shine. They their eyes light up, and they're used to that chaotic environment from that 1v1. So, but I want to shift gears a little bit into 2v2. So can you tell me a little bit about, because I've talked about 1v1 a little bit, and we actually go from 1v1 to 1v1 plus 1, which is with a 1 neutral player. But talk to me about what you guys do in that 2v2 environment. So just to get the listeners up to date, you'll separate players into teams of 2. They'll play 2 against 2, and everyone will play at the same time at a pretty small field.
Correct. Yeah. Again, the size of the field's important because it makes it crowded. And the crowded nature of the field makes it more difficult, makes it more chaotic, right? So more learning can happen. If you can play in a really tight, everybody said, like, you've heard them talk about Michael Jordan. He got in the zone where the game just slowed down around him. The game didn't slow down. He was just more comfortable playing at a faster pace than everybody else. So it seems slow to him, right?
And you see this in football players a lot with the quarterbacks, right? It seems like when they get older, even though their body can't do the same thing, they just get more comfortable, and it seems like the grades just have more time the older they get.
Yep. And their brains are able to compute so much information so quickly, so intuitively.
Yeah.
So a small field from that perspective. And in the 2v2, kids are getting in each other's way, right? Like another 2v2 is running across the middle of their game. And so they're having to assess all of that information and continue to go. But it's really engaging for kids, because they're not standing and waiting. There's nowhere to hide, right? If their teammate has the ball, they have an option of shooting, dribbling, or passing. And the only person they can pass to is you. And so you've got this responsibility to create space, to find a window that they can exploit to play you the ball. Likewise, defensively, if you fall asleep, if you decide not to get back, then your whole team's exposed, right? There's in 5v5 or 6v6, right? You can adjust to that, but in 2v2 you can't, or in 1v1 you can't. But 2v2 enables the players to work on passing combinations and teamwork and some of those things that the 1v1 doesn't. And so that's why we do the 2v2. And it's fantastic. It's wonderful. As the kids get older, I start talking about overlaps, right? And so I might put in a condition into the session that, hey, you can't score unless somebody makes an overlap run. You don't have to play them. In fact, I don't want you to play them all the time, but I want that overlap run to be made. And so then you've got, I've got 8, 9-year-olds sprinting overlaps in a session, screaming for the ball. And then when it comes Saturday and we're like, hey guys, let's look for some overlaps today. Goal for the team today is 10 overlap runs. And they're making these big, giant overlap run in the game. And it's like really very rewarding from a coaching perspective. Like, yeah, my kids get it. And it's different because in 2v2, you have to do it. So if that's the condition, whereas in 5v5 or 6v6, it doesn't have that. Every kid is not going to get the number of reps making that overlap run as they would in a 2v2. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things, though, that you said, keywords that you guys mentioned in the podcast is responsibility in this 1v1 and 2v2 environment. And one of the examples you said on the podcast, I don't know if it was you or someone else, was in most sessions, you could go to school that day And whatever that day was, you'd go to practice and you'd play 7v7, and you didn't really have to care because you were one of 14 players playing, and there wasn't any responsibility. You could just go and you could just kind of coast through practice. But with the 1v1 and the 2v2, if you get beat and you get scored on, there's no one else. There's no one that can save you but yourself. So if you're going to get beat 10-0, 10-0, 10-0 every single time, that's going to start to, look pretty bad because you're saying out your score out loud. You don't want to be the guy that says 0 and then the other guy says 10 every single time. So that responsibility of having to be present in every single session is just a fantastic point of responsibility and teaching that to players. But I want to dive into, you talked about overlaps with 2v2. So before that, what are the rules? So the players are sitting down for the first time ever. A kid has never played 2v2. What are the rules that you guys have for 2v2? And then let's start with that. And then once we're done that, let's unpack a little bit of those rules. Yeah.
So simply put, it's 2v2 soccer, right? Goals are 20, 25 yards apart, right? Going to goal. And, but there's different conditions we layer in. Early days, it's you score in that goal, then the team gets it, and then they go try to score in the other goal, right? Like it's just a soccer game from that perspective. As kids get better, and really for me, as my groups become more homogenous, whereas every game is truly a 50-50, you don't know who's going to win, anybody could win either side, then we start playing make it, take it, right? And so if we put it in the back of the net, we can get it out of the net as quickly as we can, turn and go score in the other goal as quickly as we can, because that puts more pressure on the defense, right? It requires the kids to defend to a greater degree, not just let the game go, let the ball hit the back of the net, then they get it and they get to attack. And so that's a big function of it. But then there's all types of conditions we can add to it, right? 1 touch, 2 touch, or a fake and move within 2 is the condition we used as kids most often. And I use it most often with the groups that I coach. That means that it's 2 touches. You have to shoot, pass, or do a fake and move. So one of the fakes, one of our maestro skills we do in those first 2 touches. If you didn't do it within those first 2 touches, it's a turnover and the other player gets it. And I love that condition because it encourages fast speed of play, right? That's why my college coach had us play 2 touch all the time, right? Yeah. But that takes away the option to dribble, and taking away the option to dribble is like one of the best ways to attack, right? And so it's limiting what your players can do long-term. And so by having 1 touch, 2 touch, or a fake and move within 2, I have to have a high speed of play. Before I receive the ball, I have got to already decided what my next action is. And if I'm going to dribble, I've got to do something deceptive before I can go on a dribble.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you talked about overlaps. How do you teach overlaps to your players?
Yes. I mean, like a crazy man. I mean, you can hear the enthusiasm in my voice. This is how I coach. Initially it's just, this is what an overlap is. And it's just me running and doing overlap and demonstrating it. Right. Yeah. And then it's, here, 20 kids in my session, you 10 right here, you have a ball at your feet. All right. For the next minute, everybody's going to overlap different guys with the ball. And it's just chaos, but it's like, see how many overlaps you can get in a minute. And the kids are sprinting around trying to do overlaps. And then I'm stopping, freeze. I'm seeing this run. That's not necessarily an overlap. Let me show you what it should look like. So I'm correcting it. Then we swap. Now the other half is doing their crazy overlap runs. Perfect. Now you've got it, guys. We're going to play 2v2s. But you can't score until your team makes an overlap run. But then the 2v2 is going, right? And if I've got, 12 kids in my 2v2, that's 2 goalkeepers. And if I've got 14, that'd be 2 goalkeepers and then 3 games of 2v2s for those 12 kids. And now I'm in the field and stop, freeze. Guys, I want to show you guys what I just saw. Will, can you demonstrate that again, that overlap run you did? And it's Will. And I make sure I point out the overlap that I'm kind of looking for and celebrate it. But kids figure it out pretty quickly. It's not a complex concept.
Yeah. And when do you use overlaps in the game? Like what would be an appropriate time for a kid to overlap? Because I remember this is actually a pretty funny story. My coach taught me an overlap. This was when I was playing in Toronto, and he was like, hey, everyone, I want everyone to use overlaps in the game. And we got to a game, and it was a pretty important game. I was playing center forward, and we had a winger. And right off the kickoff, I passed it back and I just ran and overlapped the winger. And it made absolutely no sense. And I was looking at the coach like, look what I did. And he's like, that's not the right time. So when would I use the overlap during the game?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, obviously, an outside back overlapping an outside mid is like the most common overlap that we see, right? And so that's the most often one that we'll see. But genuinely, when I'm coaching kids, and Andy was big on this, like when we're in possession, you have no position, right? And so like we were, as you could imagine, super on the creative end of the game and not super structured in terms of our systems. And I genuinely think that's how youth teams should be today, because whatever system that your high school coach, or your college coach, or your pro coach is going to play is going to be probably different than the one that you did now. And so we should be encouraging more creativity, less structure on the attacking side of the ball for sure. And so I encourage kids to do overlaps in any opportunity and then adjust from there, right? Use their sub time to talk about like, hey, that's probably not, you actually had to run backward to do an overlap. That's probably not ideal, right? And so, and specifically Will on my 2013 team, he's notorious for running backward to do an overlap, but I love the enthusiasm because he's bought into it. He's engaged with it. And so he's not going to still be 17 running back from his center forward position and doing an overlap from a center midfielder. And so at doing that at 9, I'm like, this is pretty good. Like, you know, this is clay I can mold. I can get going over time, but I'm not in a rush to do it, if that makes sense. Buy-in and engagement is the most important thing first.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And can you talk about, I mean, obviously 1v1s, 2v2s we've spoken about, we've talked about shooting a little bit, well, most of it. Just kind of last thoughts and how you've seen this, you know, the structure of what you guys have been able to create with this environment, this chaotic environment, and what it can really do for players.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just this enthusiasm of really, really giving kids a platform to go for it, to not be afraid to make mistakes, to be willing to, to take the team, put them on their back and go. Andy always talked to us as kids. He's like, guys, we're talking soccer, and I want you guys to get the ball. When you get the ball, feel like you can do it and you can make something happen. But really, it's not about that. It's about life. And he's talking to a bunch of teenager kids. So all of our eyes rolled, a collective groan occurred, but I remember it. So I think it matters. He goes, I want you guys to be the kind of kids that, you go to college, after college, you go get a job, and you get a job and you're sat in the boardroom, and the CEO walks into the room and he says, guys, the company's going under. Like we need a Hail Mary, and I've got no ideas. Does anybody have an idea of how we save this company? And he goes, and Andy's like, I want you guys to be the kind of guys that stick your hand in the air. Here, I got an idea. Let's go for it. Like not being afraid of failure and being willing to put anything on the table and let's see what happens. And as a result. And so when we talk about 1v1, the competitive cauldron that we create, the environment that is encouraging kids to fight and to go for it and not be scared or have a fear of failure. We're talking about Ronaldo's, we're talking about Messi's, we're talking about Zidane, right? We're talking about those players that want to make something happen, not just sideways and backwards passing till the cows come home. But we're also talking about creating people that as they become adults, they're our progress makers. They're the ones that are creating ideas that take our society to the next level instead of running and hiding or being concerned that this might not work out. So low risk, let's just pass it sideways and backwards.
And I think, it's a great way to end. And we see this with the best teams in the world. You see this with the best players in the world. They're the ones that want to make a difference. And the coaches that are out there that are managing these players, that's what they say about these players, that these guys are leaders, that they're creative, and they're the ones that in that last moment, you want them to have the ball. I had Anson Dorrance on the show. It's exactly what he's talking about. And his program has developed over 100 professional players. So this is kind of the way things should be going, but they're not in youth soccer. Do you have any ideas why or what we could change, you think?
So, I mean, it comes back to what I said earlier. I think oftentimes we as youth coaches try to create an environment and run sessions that are really, really structured where we can control everything, right? And it comes from a good place, right? It's not this like alter ego, like maniacal, like ha, 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 I've got all my robots on the field, but and so there's this over focus on controlling every aspect of the session to make it look and feel really structured, that produces vanilla players, right?
Yeah.
Produces players that aren't creative enough, or willing to take risks enough. I love football. I love American football, right? Big Chiefs fan. Love to watch it. Played it actually a little bit growing up. But what American football has entirely wrong from a child development perspective, and I'm not even talking about the physical side of it, I'm just talking about the conceptual side of it, is that in American football, the two generals of the two opposing armies pick the play for the battle, for that play. And then those players, there is no creativity within it. Yeah. Their job is to carry out that task. And soccer is not that. That's what makes it the best sport in the world. Soccer is an activity where every single player, when they have the ball at their feet, is a quarterback, right? Yep. And every quarterback has 360 degrees where they can go with the ball. Many different levels. They can play the ball on the ground. They can play it in the air, right? They can dribble. They can pass. They can shoot. And there's, it's 11v11. There's 10 teammates, 11 opponents. There's so many different permutations of combinations that can happen. And so if we as coaches, as a society, look to not limit, but instead create environments and just get out of the way and let the kids play, we're going to find that we achieve at a much higher rate than we have thus far. The biggest mistake and I'll say America, I know you're Canadian, but maybe North America, with the exception of Mexico, have made is I think we've tried to be too much like the English. And too structured in the way that the game has played. And of course, it makes sense that the English have had a giant impact on our game. They speak the same language as us, right? And so it's easy for their coaches to come over here and train our coaches. And I genuinely think creativity and a lack of structure and an environment that encourages that is the way forward for us.
I completely agree. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Andrew.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Coaching Soccer Weekly. I really enjoyed my conversation with Andrew, and the day after I recorded with Andrew, I actually went out, did a private session with one of my players, and really put in a lot of his coaching points, and it went really well. By the end of the session, he's a 2013 player, so he's a U9, and we were using size 5 by the end because he was able to kick it that hard with power. So another big thanks to Andrew for coming on the show. Next week, I have another coach who reached out to me and had him on the show.
Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end. And you can check out more of our videos right here. And if you haven't done so already, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and the subscribe button.